CEO refuses to shake hands with Janitor. Board votes him out minutes later. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gleaming marble lobby of Nexus Technologies, its rays catching the polished chrome and glass that screamed success. At 7:47 a.m., the building hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Keyboards clicking, elevators ascending, coffee brewing in executive kitchens. But for Luis Morales, the day had started 3 hours earlier. His weathered hands gripped the industrial mop as he made his final pass through the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. 23 years. 23 years of arriving before dawn, of cleaning up after people who earned more in a day than he made in a year. His knees ached, a constant reminder of decades spent on floors, reaching under desks, scrubbing away the evidence of corporate excess. "Morning, Luis." The security guard's voice crackled through his radio. "Big day today, huh?" "Quarterly review." Luis smiled to himself as he adjusted his uniform shirt, the same navy blue he'd worn for over 2 decades, though the company logo had changed 3 times. "Every day's a big day here, Marcus. These folks, they live for their numbers." He'd seen it all in his years at Nexus. The late-night crisis meetings, the tears shed in bathroom stalls after layoffs, the champagne celebrations when stock prices soared. Luis had become invisible furniture, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. He'd cleaned blood from the carpet when a young executive had a stress-induced nosebleed, disposed of pregnancy tests left behind by terrified interns, and swept up the broken glass from frames thrown in rage during hostile takeovers. But Luis didn't mind being invisible. What bothered him was the cruelty. The elevator dinged, and Luis knew exactly who was arriving. Gavin Reeds, CEO for the past 5 years, architect of Nexus's most profitable era, and the coldest man Luis had ever encountered in 2 decades of working for demanding bosses. Luis finished his mopping and began gathering his supplies. He'd learned to time his exits perfectly, present enough to do his job, invisible enough to avoid confrontation. But today, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with tension, as if the building knew something was about to shift. The boardroom doors were solid glass, and through them, Luis could see the arriving executives. Ruth Chin-Williams, one of the original co-founders, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp despite her 71 years. David Park, the CFO, nervously adjusting his tie. Sarah Martinez, head of human resources, clutching a tablet like a shield. And then there was Gavin. Even from a distance, Gavin Reeds commanded attention. 43 years old, 6'2", with the kind of sharp features that looked carved from marble. His suit, a bespoke creation that cost more than Luis's car, fit him like armor. Everything about Gavin screamed power, from his purposeful stride to the way subordinates scattered from his path like frightened birds. Luis had watched Gavin's rise with the detached interest of someone observing nature documentaries. Brilliant, ruthless, effective, Gavin had transformed Nexus from a struggling startup into a tech giant worth billions. Stock prices had tripled under his leadership. Employees feared him, investors worshipped him, and competitors studied him. But Luis remembered a different version of Nexus Technologies. He remembered when it was just Chin-Williams Tech, operating out of a converted warehouse in the industrial district. Ruth and her late husband David had started the company with 3 employees and a dream of making technology accessible to everyone. Luis had been hired as their first janitor when the company had 12 people and everyone knew each other's names. Back then, Ruth would bring homemade cookies for the late shifts. David Williams would roll up his sleeves and help Luis move furniture when they needed to reconfigure the workspace. They'd asked about his family, remembered his daughter's graduation, sent flowers when his wife passed away 5 years ago. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. The elevator doors opened again, and Luis's heart skipped. 3 men in expensive suits stepped out, board members he recognized but had never spoken to. Their faces were grim, their conversations hushed. Something was definitely happening today. Luis pushed his cart toward the service elevator, but as he rounded the corner, he nearly collided with Gavin's entourage. 3 assistants flanked the CEO, young, eager, and terrified. Luis had seen dozens of assistants cycle through Gavin's office. The man was notorious for his impossible demands and hair-trigger temper. "Sir, the Peterson projections need your review before," one assistant began. Not now, Jennifer. And it's Ms. Peterson, not Peterson. Show some respect. Gavin's voice was sharp, dismissive. I want absolute silence until we reach the boardroom. This is the most important meeting of the quarter. Luis stepped aside, pressing himself against the wall to let them pass. But as Gavin approached the boardroom doors, something unexpected happened. Luis, without thinking, moved to hold the heavy glass door open. It was instinct, 23 years of service ingrained in his bones. He'd opened thousands of doors for thousands of executives, a small gesture of courtesy that had become as natural as breathing. "Morning, sir," Luis said with a respectful nod. His voice warmed despite the coldness radiating from the man before him. And then, in a moment that would change everything, Luis extended his hand. It wasn't presumptuous, just a simple gesture of human connection. A handshake between two people sharing the same space, breathing the same air, existing in the same moment. Luis had shaken hands with Ruth countless times, with David Williams, with dozens of executives over the years. It was basic courtesy, an acknowledgement of shared humanity. Gavin's ice-blue eyes flicked down to Luis's outstretched hand, calloused, weathered, honest, and something twisted in his expression. Disgust? Disdain? It was there for just a split second, but Luis saw it. He saw it, and felt something inside his chest crack. Gavin didn't just ignore the handshake. He recoiled from it. "I don't have time for this," Gavin muttered, pushing past Luis without so much as a glance. His assistants followed, their eyes carefully averted, pretending they hadn't witnessed their boss's casual cruelty. Luis stood frozen, his hands still extended in the empty air. The rejection hit him like a physical blow. Not just the refusal, but the contempt behind it. In that moment, he wasn't Luis Morales, dedicated employee of 23 years. He wasn't a man with a family, with struggles, with dignity. He was nothing, less than nothing. The boardroom door swung shut, leaving Luis alone in the hallway with his cart, his mop, and his shattered dignity. But Luis wasn't the only one who had witnessed the moment. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, every person at that polished conference table had seen the interaction. They'd watched their CEO, the man who spoke eloquently about company values and corporate culture, treat a human being like contaminated waste. Ruth Chin Williams sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. But behind her calm exterior, something was building, a storm that had been gathering for months, fed by whispered complaints from employees, by the gradual erosion of everything she and her husband had built. David Park cleared his throat nervously. "Gavin, perhaps we should. We should focus on the numbers," Gavin interrupted, settling into his chair with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own authority. "The quarterly report shows exceptional growth across all sectors. Stock prices are at an all-time high. Our efficiency metrics." Efficiency. Ruth's voice cut through the room like a blade. She spoke quietly, but something in her tone made everyone freeze. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Gavin paused, his presentation remote halfway to the screen. "I'm sorry, the way you just treated Luis. Is that part of our efficiency metrics?" The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Every person at that table held their breath, sensing that something fundamental was about to shift. Gavin's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ruth. We have a lot to cover today, and I'd prefer to stay focused on." "Luis Morales has worked for this company for 23 years. Ruth's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. "He's been here longer than anyone except me. He worked through the night during the COVID lockdowns when everyone else was safe at home. He stayed late to clean up after the server room flood in 2019. He's never missed a day, never complained, never asked for recognition." "And your point is?" Gavin's tone was sharp, defensive. "My point is that you couldn't even look at him. You treated him like he was diseased." Ruth leaned forward, her eyes locked on Gavin's. "That man held the door for you, offered you a simple handshake, basic human courtesy, and you acted like he was beneath your notice." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Sarah Martinez stared at her hands. David Park loosened his tie. The tension in the room was suffocating. "I don't have time to socialize with every employee," Gavin said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I'm running a billion-dollar company, not a friendship club." "No," Ruth said, standing slowly. "You're running my company. The company my husband and I built on the belief that every person has value. That success means nothing if it comes at the cost of your soul. Outside the glass doors, Luis had finished gathering his supplies. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped with a weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. He'd experienced discrimination before, subtle slights, condescending tones, the invisible barriers that kept people like him in their place. But this felt different. This felt personal. As he walked toward the service elevator, Luis didn't notice the eyes watching him from inside the boardroom. He didn't see Ruth's expression soften with something that might have been maternal protectiveness, or David Park's guilty fidgeting, or Sarah Martinez's barely contained tears. But they saw him. They saw a man who had dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to a company that had forgotten his name. They saw dignity in his slow, measured steps, grace in his refusal to let bitterness show on his face. And they saw what their CEO had become. "This meeting is about numbers," Gavin said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Profit margins, market share, growth projections. Not about hurt feelings or social justice lectures." "Is it?" Ruth asked. "Because I'm looking at the numbers, Gavin, and I'm seeing something you might have missed." She pulled out a tablet, her fingers moving across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been in tech since before most people knew what the internet was. Employee satisfaction scores, down 18% in the last year. Turnover rate, up 23%. Exit interview citations about toxic leadership culture, up 41%. Ruth looked up from the tablet, her eyes cold. "Those are numbers too, Gavin. And they tell a story about the kind of leader you've become." The room was silent except for the sound of Gavin's breathing, which had become shallow and rapid. His face was flushed, his hands clenched on the conference table. "I've increased shareholder value by destroying everything David and I built," Ruth interrupted. "By turning this company into a place where basic human decency is seen as a weakness." Outside, Luis pressed the elevator button and waited. The hallway was empty now, just him and the lingering scent of industrial cleaner. He thought about going home, about calling in sick for the first time in years. His daughter Maria would understand. She'd been telling him for months that he deserved better, that he should find a company that valued him. But Luis had never been a quitter. Even when his wife was dying, even when the medical bills piled up, even when he had to work double shifts to keep their apartment, he'd never given up. He'd always believed that hard work and dignity would eventually be rewarded, that persistence would pay off. Today, for the first time in 23 years, that belief felt naive. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and Luis stepped inside. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of the boardroom through the glass walls. The executives were standing now, their voices raised, their gestures animated. Something was happening, something big. Luis pushed the button for the ground floor and tried not to care. But deep in his heart, beneath the hurt and humiliation, a small flame of hope flickered. Because Luis had seen something in Ruth's eyes as she watched the interaction. Something that reminded him of the old days, when Chun Williams Tech was more than just a name on a stock ticker. Something that looked like justice. The elevator descended, carrying Luis away from the executive floor and toward an uncertain future. Behind him, 42 floors above the city, the most important conversation in Nexus Technologies' history was about to begin. And Gavin Reeds, architect of efficiency and profits, had no idea that his empire was about to crumble. The silence in the boardroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Gavin Reeds straightened his tie, a gesture that had become his signature tell when he felt his control slipping. Around the polished mahogany table, 8 board members sat in various states of discomfort, their usual confidence replaced by something far more dangerous: moral clarity. "I think we're losing perspective here," Gavin said, his voice carrying the smooth authority that had closed billion-dollar deals. "Ruth, I understand you're sentimental about the early days, but we can't run a modern corporation based on feelings." "That janitor." "Luis," Sarah Martinez interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Luis." Gavin's eyes snapped to the HR director. Sarah was usually his ally, the one who executed his efficiency measures without question. Her defection was unexpected, alarming. "Fine, Luis." Gavin's tone made the name sound like a concession. "He's an employee. A good employee, I'm sure. But I'm not required to shake hands with every person who works here. That's not how business operates." Bullshit. The profanity came from Michael Chong, the board's technology advisor and the youngest member at 38. His face was flushed with anger, his usually calm demeanor shattered. Michael, Gavin began. No, let me finish. Michael stood, his chair scraping against the floor. My father was a janitor. Worked nights at an office building in downtown Portland for 30 years. And you know what? The good executives, the ones worth working for, they knew his name. They asked about his family. They treated him like a human being. The room was electric with tension. Michael had never spoken about his background, had cultivated the image of a tech prodigy who'd emerged fully formed from Silicon Valley's ecosystem. This personal revelation hung in the air like a challenge. The bad executives? Michael continued, his voice shaking with emotion. They looked right through him, like he was furniture, like he didn't matter. He pointed at Gavin with trembling finger. Just like you did to Luis. Ruth watched the exchange with satisfaction. She'd been planning this moment for months, waiting for the right catalyst. Gavin's casual cruelty had given her the opening she needed. I think we need to take a step back, said Thomas Bradford, the board's financial advisor. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many corporate meltdowns. This is getting emotional when we should be discussing. When we should be discussing what? Ruth's voice cut through his diplomatic tone. Quarterly earnings? Stock prices? Let me tell you what I've been discussing, Thomas. I've been having conversations with employees. Real conversations. She opened her tablet again, scrolling through documents she'd been compiling for weeks. Janet Morrison, administrative assistant on the 15th floor, quit last month after Gavin berated her for 15 minutes because she brought him the wrong coffee. She'd been here 8 years. Ruth's voice was steady, methodical. Derek Phillips, senior developer, left for a competitor after Gavin publicly humiliated him during a presentation. Marcus Washington, security supervisor, put in for a transfer to our Seattle office because, quote, the environment here has become toxic. Each name was a small explosion in the room. These weren't abstract statistics. They were people the board members knew, had worked with, respected. Every corporation has turnover, Gavin said, but his voice lacked conviction. That's the nature of. The nature of what? David Park had been silent until now, his loyalty to Gavin warring with his own conscience. The nature of treating people like disposable resources? The nature of creating a workplace where fear is the primary motivator. Gavin turned on his CFO with barely contained fury. David, you've seen the numbers. Productivity is up. Profits are up. Stock prices are built on the backs of people who are afraid to speak up, David interrupted. You know how many calls I get from employees asking about early retirement? About transfer opportunities? About whether their jobs are safe if they disagree with you. The words hung in the air like an accusation. David had been Gavin's right hand for 3 years, had executed every cost-cutting measure, every efficiency initiative. His betrayal cut deeper than the others. This is unbelievable, Gavin said, his composure finally cracking. We're going to tank the company's performance because I didn't shake hands with the cleaning staff? No, Ruth said, standing slowly. We're going to save the company because you don't understand the difference between leadership and tyranny. Outside the boardroom, the executive floor buzzed with its usual activity. Assistants hurried between offices, phones rang constantly. The machinery of corporate success hummed along efficiently. But in the service areas, away from the marble and chrome, a different conversation was taking place. Luis sat in the break room on the 3rd floor, a small space reserved for custodial and maintenance staff. His hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Across from him, Maria Santos, the night shift supervisor, watched him with concern. You okay, Luis? You look like you've seen a ghost. Luis managed a weak smile. Just a long morning, Maria. You know how it is. But Maria had known Luis for 15 years, had worked alongside him through late nights and early mornings. She could read the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with more than physical exhaustion. It's more than that, she said gently. What happened? Luis hesitated. He'd never been one to complain, never spoke ill of the executives who signed his paychecks. But something about this morning had broken something inside him. I tried to shake his hand, he said finally. The CEO. I held the door for him, said good morning, offered my hand. Like I've done 1,000 times with other people. Maria's expression darkened. She'd had her own encounters with Gavin Reed's, had seen the way he looked through service staff like they were invisible. And He acted like I was diseased, like touching me would contaminate him. Luis's voice was quiet, but the hurt was evident. 23 years, Maria. 23 years of getting here before anyone else, staying late, never complaining. And to him, I'm nothing. Maria reached across the table and took his hand. Calloused, honest hands that had kept this building running for over 2 decades. You're not nothing, Luis. You're worth 10 of him. Then why does it feel like I'm the one who's worthless? The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of systemic inequality, of a world where a man's value was measured by his title rather than his character. Back in the boardroom, the temperature was rising. Gavin had abandoned his presentation entirely, his carefully prepared slides forgotten as he fought for his corporate life. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice tight with desperation. The board's responsibility is to shareholders, not to employees' feelings. We have a fiduciary duty. Our duty, Ruth interrupted, is to the company's long-term health, and that includes the people who make it run. She stood and walked to the glass wall, looking out at the city below. 42 floors down, people were going about their lives, working, struggling, hoping. Once upon a time, she'd been one of them. When David and I started this company, she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the room, we had a simple philosophy. Take care of your people, and they'll take care of your business. We knew everyone's name. We celebrated their successes, supported them through their struggles. We built a family. She turned back to face the table, her eyes hard as steel. You've turned that family into a machine. A efficient, profitable machine that chews up human beings and spits out stock dividends. That's not fair, Gavin protested. I've increased the company's value by creating a culture of fear, Michael Chong interrupted. By making employees afraid to innovate, afraid to take risks, afraid to be human. The tech industry is competitive, Gavin shot back. We can't afford to. To what? To treat people with dignity. Sarah Martinez was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Do you know how many harassment complaints I've buried because people were afraid to speak up? How many good employees we've lost because they couldn't stand the environment you've created? The admission shocked everyone in the room. Sarah had always been professional, composed, the perfect corporate soldier. Her breakdown was devastating in its honesty. I've enabled this, she whispered. I've been complicit in turning this place into a nightmare for anyone who isn't at the top of the food chain. Thomas Bradford, the financial advisor who'd tried to maintain neutrality, found himself thinking about his own interactions with Gavin. The casual dismissals, the cutting remarks, the way he treated anyone below his level as expendable. The numbers don't lie, Gavin, he said finally. But they don't tell the whole story either. A company is more than its profit margins. Jesus Christ, Gavin exploded, standing so violently that his chair toppled backward. You're all losing your minds over a handshake. One moment of what? Ruth's voice was dangerously quiet. Of showing us exactly who you are? Of demonstrating that you have no respect for the people who make this company possible. She walked back to her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled. That wasn't just a handshake, Gavin. That was a glimpse into your soul. And what we saw was empty. The words hit Gavin like physical blows. He looked around the table, searching for allies, for anyone who would support him. But the faces staring back at him were united in their disappointment, their disgust, their determination. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking. You can't run a corporation based on sentiment. The shareholders will thank us, Ruth said calmly, when they realize we've saved them from the lawsuit that was coming. The room went silent. Even Gavin stopped pacing. What lawsuit? David Park asked. Ruth's smile was grim. Sexual harassment. Workplace discrimination. Hostile work environment. Take your pick. Sarah's not the only one who's been documenting problems. I've been receiving reports for months. Complaints that were buried, employees who were intimidated into silence, a pattern of abuse that starts at the top and filters down through the entire organization. She pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table with a heavy thud. Legal has been building a case against us for weeks. They're just waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they do, all those beautiful stock prices you're so proud of will evaporate overnight. Gavin's face went white. You're bluffing. Am I? Ruth opened the folder, revealing pages of complaints, documented incidents, sworn statements. Janet Morrison's termination. Derek Phillips' humiliation. 3 separate incidents of you berating female employees to the point of tears. And those are just the ones brave enough to report. The folder was thick with evidence, months of careful documentation that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Gavin stared at it like it was a snake poised to strike. "This is all about a handshake," he whispered. "No," Ruth said firmly. "This is about leadership. This is about the kind of company we want to be. This is about whether we're going to honor the values that built this place or let you destroy everything we've worked for." She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. The handshake was just the final straw, the moment that crystallized everything we've been pretending not to see. Outside the boardroom, the building continued its daily rhythm. Employees worked at their desks, unaware that their futures were being decided 40 floors above them. In the service areas, Luis had finished his coffee and returned to work, pushing his cart through endless hallways with the mechanical precision of decades of practice. But something had changed. Word was spreading through the invisible network that connected service workers, security guards, and administrative staff. Luis's story was being told in whispers, passed from person to person like a virus of discontent. The cleaning staff had always been invisible, but they saw everything. They knew which executives stayed late to help struggling employees, and which ones threw tantrums when their coffee was the wrong temperature. They knew who treated them with respect, and who looked through them like they were furniture. And they were talking. Maria Santos found herself in conversations she'd never had before. Guards and janitors and maintenance workers sharing stories of disrespect, of casual cruelty, of a workplace culture that had slowly poisoned itself from the top down. "It's got to change," she told a group of night shift workers. "We can't keep accepting this." "What can we do?" asked James, a security guard who'd been with the company for 12 years. "We're replaceable. They fire us. They hire someone else tomorrow." "Are we?" Maria asked. "Are we really? Who's going to keep this place running? Who's going to know where everything is, how everything works? Who's going to care about this building like we do?" The questions hung in the air, challenging assumptions that had gone unexamined for years. The service staff had always accepted their invisibility as the price of employment. But Luis's humiliation had sparked something deeper, a recognition of their own dignity, their own worth. In the boardroom, the final act was beginning. Gavin had exhausted his arguments, his justifications, his deflections. The board members sat in judgment, their decision already made. "I think we need to call for a vote," Ruth said quietly. "A vote on what?" Gavin asked, though he already knew. "A vote of no confidence in your leadership. A motion to remove you as Chief Executive Officer of Nexus Technologies." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Gavin looked around the table one last time, searching for any sign of support, any hint of doubt. He found none. "All in favor of the motion to remove Gavin Reeds as CEO?" Ruth asked. 8 hands rose in the air. Not one dissenting vote. Not one voice raised in his defense. Unanimous. "The motion carries," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Gavin, you're relieved of your duties as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." Gavin stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, he'd gone from the most powerful person in the building to an unemployed executive with a reputation in ruins. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice hollow. "You'll regret this. The company will." "The company will survive," Ruth said firmly. "It survived before you, and it will thrive after you." Security was already at the door, not to escort him out, not yet, but to ensure the transition was orderly. Gavin looked at them and saw not corporate soldiers, but people he'd never bothered to know, faces he'd never troubled to remember. "Clean out your office," Ruth continued. "You have 2 hours. Security will escort you when you're ready to leave." Gavin walked toward the door on unsteady legs, his world crumbling around him. As he reached for the handle, he paused and looked back at the woman who had just destroyed his career. "You'll destroy this company," he said. "Without me, you'll lose everything." Ruth met his gaze without flinching. "We already lost everything that mattered. Now we're going to get it back." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the board members alone with the weight of their decision. For a moment, no one spoke. They'd just fired the most successful CEO in the company's history, the man who'd taken them from struggling startup to corporate giant. The financial implications were staggering, the risks enormous. But as they sat in the silence, Each of them thought about Luis Morales standing in the hallway with his hand extended, dignity intact despite the casual cruelty he'd endured. And they knew they'd made the right choice. So, David Park said finally, breaking the silence. What happens now? Ruth looked around the table at the faces of her colleagues. People who'd found their courage, their conscience, their humanity. Now, she said, we remember who we used to be, and we build something better. Outside, 42 floors below, Luis was emptying trash cans in the accounting department. He worked with the same careful attention he'd shown for 23 years, unaware that his dignity had just changed the trajectory of a billion-dollar corporation. But change was coming. Justice was coming. And for the first time in years, hope was coming too. 2 hours later, the executive floor hummed with a different energy. Word had spread through the building's invisible networks. The assistants who knew everything, the security guards who saw everything, the service staff who cleaned up after everything. Gavin Reeds was gone, escorted out with his box of personal items and his shattered pride. Ruth Chin Williams, co-founder and conscience of the company, was the new interim CEO. But Luis Morales was still cleaning toilets on the third floor. He'd heard whispers, caught fragments of conversations as he moved through the building. Something about a boardroom confrontation, about Gavin being fired, about everything changing. But Luis had learned not to hope too much. He'd seen executives come and go, promises made and broken, reforms announced and quietly forgotten. Still, as he worked, he couldn't shake the memory of Ruth's eyes in the boardroom. The way she'd watched the interaction with Gavin, the expression on her face. It reminded him of the old days, when Chun Williams Tech was young and everyone mattered. Luis. A voice called from behind him. He turned to see Jennifer Mills, one of Gavin's former assistants. She looked different somehow, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Yes, miss. Ms. Chin Williams would like to see you in her office. The executive suite. Luis's heart skipped. In 23 years, he'd never been summoned to the executive floor for anything other than an emergency cleaning situation. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Maybe he was being fired for the handshake incident. Maybe they thought he'd been gossiping about Gavin. Maybe. Luis. Jennifer's voice was gentle, concerned. It's not bad news. I promise. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal. Luis clutched his cap in his hands, his uniform crisp but somehow inadequate for the polished world he was entering. The executive suite was a realm of marble and mahogany, original art and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. Ruth's office was smaller than Gavin's had been, but warmer. Where Gavin had displayed awards and stock certificates, Ruth had family photos and employee recognition plaques. The desk was mahogany, but it was covered with work, real work, not just the symbols of authority. Luis, please sit down. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, and Luis sat carefully, as if the furniture might break under his weight. Ruth studied him for a moment, seeing not the invisible janitor, but the man who'd held the door with dignity intact. Do you know what happened in the boardroom this morning? She asked. Luis shook his head. Just rumors, ma'am. Something about Mr. Reeds. Mr. Reeds is no longer with the company. The board voted him out. Ruth's voice was matter of fact, but she watched Luis's reaction carefully. Luis's eyes widened. Because of what happened with me. Because of what his reaction to you revealed about the kind of leader he'd become. Ruth leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Luis, you've been here for 23 years. You've seen this company grow from a startup to a corporation. You've worked through emergencies, through reorganizations, through everything we've thrown at you. And you've done it with grace and dignity. Luis shifted uncomfortably. I just do my job, ma'am. No, Ruth said firmly. You do much more than that. You take care of this place like it's your home. You know every employee's name, every office layout, every quirk of this building. You're not just a janitor, Luis. You're the heart of this company. The words hit Luis like a revelation. For 23 years, he'd been invisible, essential but unacknowledged. To hear his values spoken aloud, by the woman who'd built this company, was overwhelming. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me, Ruth said. I'm going to rebuild this company's culture. I'm going to make it a place where everyone matters, where everyone's contribution is valued. But I can't do it alone. I need people who understand what this place could be, who remember what it used to be. Louise stared at her, confused. I'm not sure I understand. Ruth smiled, and for a moment, Louise saw the young entrepreneur who'd started a tech company in a warehouse, who'd believed that success meant lifting everyone up together. Louise, I'm offering you a promotion. Facilities supervisor. You'd oversee all building operations, manage the custodial and maintenance staff, report directly to me. You'd have an office, a salary that reflects your value, and the authority to make real changes. The silence stretched between them as Louise processed what he'd heard. Facilities supervisor. An office. After 23 years of invisibility, he was being offered visibility, respect, authority. Why me? He whispered. Because you understand this place better than anyone. Because you've earned it. Because when someone extends their hand to you in friendship, you don't recoil in disgust. You shake it. Ruth stood and walked around the desk, extending her own hand to Louise. What do you say? Louise looked at her outstretched hand, remembering the morning's humiliation, the casual cruelty that had nearly broken his spirit. But this was different. This was redemption, recognition, hope made tangible. He stood slowly and took her hand in his. The handshake was firm, warm, full of mutual respect. It lasted only seconds, but it erased 23 years of invisibility. Yes, ma'am, Louise said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd be honored. Meanwhile, 3 floors down, Gavin Reed sat in his luxury sedan in the parking garage, staring at the box of personal items on his passenger seat. A Mont Blanc pen set, a crystal paperweight, photos from corporate events where he looked powerful and untouchable, the artifacts of a career that had just imploded. His phone buzzed constantly, reporters, headhunters, former colleagues wanting to know what had happened. But Gavin couldn't bring himself to answer. How do you explain that your empire collapsed because you wouldn't shake a janitor's hand? The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 5 years building Nexus into a corporate powerhouse, had increased its value by billions, had become the kind of CEO other executives studied and envied. But in the end, it had all crumbled because of a moment of casual cruelty, a reflexive dismissal of someone he considered beneath his notice. Gavin started the engine and drove out of the garage, away from the building where he'd ruled with such cold efficiency. As he merged into traffic, he caught a glimpse of the Nexus logo in his rearview mirror, a symbol that had once represented his power, his success, his identity. Now it just reminded him of what he'd lost. Back in the building, news of Luis's promotion spread through the service staff like wildfire. Maria Santos was the first to congratulate him, tears in her eyes as she hugged her old friend. Facilities supervisor, she said, shaking her head in amazement. Luis, do you know what this means? It means I get to help people, Luis said simply. It means I get to make sure nobody else feels invisible. The impact was immediate and profound. Within hours, Ruth had instituted what she called the open door policy, not just for executives, but for everyone. Any employee, regardless of position, could schedule time with senior management to discuss concerns, suggestions, or ideas. The first person to sign up was Marcus Washington, the security supervisor who'd been planning to transfer to Seattle. Ma'am, he said, sitting nervously in Ruth's office. I've been working security here for 8 years, and I've got some ideas about how we could make this place safer, more welcoming for everyone. Ruth listened intently as Marcus outlined his vision for a security team that protected people rather than intimidated them, that served as ambassadors for the company's values rather than enforcers of executive privilege. I love it, Ruth said when he finished. Write up a proposal. Let's make it happen. The transformation accelerated. Sarah Martinez, no longer burdened by the need to bury complaints and silence victims, began implementing programs she'd only dreamed of. Mentorship opportunities for entry-level employees, mental health resources for staff dealing with workplace stress, anonymous feedback systems that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. David Park, freed from the pressure to squeeze every penny from human resources, started looking at the company's finances through a different lens. What if they invested in their people the way they invested in technology? What if employee satisfaction was treated as seriously as stock prices? Michael Chong threw himself into revamping the company's hiring and promotion practices. He'd experienced discrimination firsthand, had watched talented people passed over because they didn't fit the traditional executive mold. Now he had the power to change that. But it was Louise who became the symbol of the new Nexus technologies. On his first day as facilities supervisor, he walked through the building with a different perspective. These weren't just hallways to be cleaned and offices to be maintained. They were spaces where people spent their lives, where dreams were pursued and challenges overcome. His first initiative was simple but revolutionary: name tags for all service staff. For years, they'd been invisible, interchangeable. Now everyone would know that Maria Santos had two daughters in college, that James Rodriguez was studying for his engineering degree at night, that Patricia Williams had been keeping the cafeteria running smoothly for 15 years. People can't respect what they can't see, Luis explained to Ruth. But once they see us, really see us, everything changes. The name tags were just the beginning. Luis instituted regular staff meetings where custodial and maintenance workers could voice concerns and suggestions. He established a fund to help service employees pursue additional education or training. He created cross-training programs so people could develop new skills and advance within the company. But perhaps most importantly, he led by example. Luis treated every person he encountered, from the newest intern to the most senior executive, with the same dignity and respect he'd always shown, even when it wasn't returned. The change in company culture was palpable. Employees who'd been walking on eggshells for years began to relax, to innovate, to take the kinds of risks that drove real growth. The fear that had permeated every interaction under Gavin's leadership was replaced by something revolutionary: trust. Ruth watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and vindication. This was the company she and David had envisioned, a place where success was measured not just in dollars, but in dignity, where everyone had the opportunity to contribute and grow. 3 weeks after Gavin's departure, Ruth was reviewing quarterly projections when Jennifer Mills knocked on her door. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about the changes we've been making." Ruth looked up, curious. "Send her in." The woman who entered was in her 30s, professionally dressed, but with the slightly frazzled look of someone who'd been working too hard for too long. She introduced herself as Lisa Chun, no relation to Ruth despite the shared surname, a reporter for the business section of the city's largest newspaper. "Ms. Chun Williams, I've been hearing remarkable things about what's happening at Nexus. Employees are talking about a complete transformation in company culture. They're saying you fired your CEO because he wouldn't shake hands with a janitor. Is that true?" Ruth smiled. "It's true that we made a leadership change. It's true that we're committed to building a more inclusive, respectful workplace. As for the handshake," she paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes a single moment can crystallize everything that's been building under the surface. What matters isn't the gesture itself, but what it revealed about our values. Lisa scribbled notes furiously. "Your stock price has actually increased since the change. Investors seem to be responding positively to the new direction." "I'm not surprised," Ruth said. "Happy employees are productive employees. When people feel valued and respected, they do their best work. It's not just good ethics, it's good business." The interview continued for an hour, with Lisa asking probing questions about the company's transformation. But she was most interested in Luis's story, the janitor who'd become a supervisor, whose dignity in the face of disrespect had catalyzed change throughout the organization. "Could I speak with him?" Lisa asked. Ruth made the call, and minutes later, Luis appeared in the doorway. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and slacks now, the uniform of management rather than service. But his eyes held the same warmth, the same quiet dignity that had impressed Ruth from the beginning. "Mr. Morales," Lisa said, "you've become something of a symbol for the changes at Nexus. How does it feel to go from janitor to supervisor in a matter of weeks?" Luis considered the question carefully. "It feels like coming home," he said finally. "For 23 years, I loved this company, took care of this building like it was my own house. But I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. Now I feel like I belong." What would you say to other companies struggling with similar cultural issues? "I'd say that respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. Every person who works for you has a story, has dreams, has value. When you recognize that, when you treat people like human beings instead of resources, amazing things happen." Lisa's article ran on the front page of the business section the following Sunday. The handshake that changed everything told the story of Nexus Technologies' transformation, of a company that had rediscovered its soul by recognizing the dignity of its humblest employee. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other companies began reaching out, wanting to learn about Nexus's approach to corporate culture. Business schools added Ruth's leadership transition to their curricula. Luis found himself invited to speak at conferences about workplace dignity and respect. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Nexus employees themselves. Productivity was up, turnover was down. The anonymous employee satisfaction surveys that Sarah Martinez conducted showed the highest scores in company history. People are proud to work here again, Sarah reported to the board. They're telling their friends about us, recommending us as an employer. Our reputation is becoming one of our greatest assets. Ruth nodded, thinking about the conversation she'd had with her late husband David years ago, when they'd first dreamed of starting their own company. What kind of business do you want to build? He'd asked. The kind where everyone matters, she'd replied. It had taken years of growth, success, and near-catastrophic failure to fulfill that promise. But now, watching Luis train new supervisors with the same patience and dignity he'd shown as a janitor, Ruth knew they'd finally gotten it right. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete. Building a truly inclusive culture was an ongoing process, requiring constant vigilance and commitment. But the foundation was solid now, built on the radical idea that every person deserved respect, regardless of their position on the organizational chart. In his new office, small but with a window overlooking the city, Luis kept a photo from his first day as facilities supervisor. Ruth was shaking his hand, both of them smiling, surrounded by the custodial staff who'd become his team. It reminded him daily that dignity, once lost, could be reclaimed. That invisible people could become visible through the simple act of being seen. And that sometimes the most powerful force in the world was an extended hand, waiting to be shaken. 6 months after the handshake heard around the corporate world, Nexus Technologies was unrecognizable from the company Gavin Reed's had ruled with such cold efficiency. The transformation went deeper than policies and procedures. It had fundamentally altered the DNA of the organization. Luis Morales stood in his office, reviewing the monthly facilities report with Maria Santos, who'd been promoted to assistant facilities manager. The numbers told a story of success. Maintenance costs down 15% due to proactive care rather than crisis response. Employee satisfaction with building services up 43%, and zero complaints about custodial staff interactions in 6 months. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the faces of the people walking past his office window. "Look at them, Maria," Luis said, gesturing toward the bustling hallway. "Remember how everyone used to walk around here? Heads down, shoulders hunched, afraid to make eye contact." Maria nodded, remembering the atmosphere of fear that had permeated every corner of the building under Gavin's leadership. Now employees greeted each other in the hallways, lingered in common areas for conversations that weren't work-related, actually seemed to enjoy being at the office. "It's like watching people come back to life," she said. The transformation had been systematic and intentional. Ruth had assembled what she called the Culture Committee, a diverse group of employees from every level and department tasked with identifying problems and implementing solutions. Luis served as co-chair alongside Jennifer Mills, Gavin's former assistant, who'd revealed a talent for organizational psychology once freed from the toxic dynamics of her previous role. Their first initiative had been revolutionary: reverse mentoring. Senior executives were paired with entry-level employees for monthly conversations about workplace experience, challenges, and opportunities for improvement. The program had been met with skepticism initially, but the results were undeniable. David Park, the CFO who'd once been Gavin's loyal lieutenant, found himself learning from Maya Patel, a recent college graduate working in accounts receivable. Maya's fresh perspective on financial processes had led to a streamlined invoicing system that saved the company hundreds of hours per month. More importantly, their conversations had helped David understand how his decisions affected people throughout the organization. "I used to think about employees as line items on a budget," David admitted during one of the Culture Committee meetings. "Maya helped me see them as individuals with mortgages and student loans and dreams. It changed everything about how I approach financial planning." Michael Chong had taken the reverse mentoring concept even further, creating cross-departmental innovation teams that brought together employees from all levels to tackle company challenges. The diversity of perspectives had generated solutions that the old executive-only decision-making process never could have produced. Sarah Martinez was perhaps the most transformed of all the senior staff. No longer burdened with suppressing complaints and managing the fallout from toxic leadership, she'd become an advocate for employee development and well-being. The programs she'd implemented, mental health support, flexible work arrangements, professional development opportunities, had become the gold standard that other companies tried to emulate. But it wasn't just the executives who were changing. The transformation was happening at every level of the organization. James Rodriguez, the security guard who'd been studying engineering at night, had been accepted into the company's new tuition assistance program. With financial support and flexible scheduling, he was on track to earn his degree in 2 years. His goal was to join the facilities engineering team, working alongside the man who'd once been invisible to him. Patricia Williams, the longtime cafeteria manager, had been given the resources to completely revamp the dining facilities. What had once been a sterile corporate cafeteria was now a warm, welcoming space where employees from all departments gathered to eat, collaborate, and build relationships. Patricia's pride in her work was evident in every detail, from the locally sourced ingredients to the comfortable seating areas designed for both quick meals and longer conversations. The changes had attracted attention from outside the company as well. The Harvard Business Review published a case study on Nexus's transformation. Fortune magazine included Ruth on their list of CEOs to watch. Most significantly, the company had been selected as one of the best places to work by multiple industry publications. But success brought its own challenges. Ruth was reviewing resumes in her office when Luis knocked on her door. Even after 6 months, he still approached her office with a mixture of respect and slight disbelief that he had access to the CEO's time and attention. "Luis, come in. What's on your mind?" "We've got a problem," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "A good problem, but still a problem." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "Applications. We're getting buried in job applications. Word has gotten out about the changes here, and everyone wants to work for us. HR is overwhelmed trying to process them all." It was true. The company's reputation as an employer had transformed dramatically. Where they'd once struggled to attract top talent, now they had their pick of candidates from every field. The challenge was maintaining their culture while scaling their operations. "How many applications are we talking about?" Ruth asked. "Sarah says they're getting about 50 resumes a day for every open position. And not just entry-level jobs. Senior executives from other companies are reaching out about leadership opportunities." Ruth leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. Rapid growth was good for business, but it could also dilute the culture they'd worked so hard to build. Every new hire was someone who hadn't lived through the transformation, who might not understand or appreciate the values that had driven the change. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. It was a question that the old Ruth, or any traditional CEO, might not have asked a facilities supervisor. But Luis's insights had proven invaluable over the past 6 months. His perspective from the ground level, his understanding of how policies affected real people, had influenced every major decision. "I think we need to be selective," Luis said. "Not just about skills and experience, but about character. We need people who understand that success isn't just about the bottom line. It's about lifting everyone up together." Ruth nodded. "What would that look like practically? What if every candidate, regardless of position, spent time with different departments? Not just traditional interviews, but real conversations with employees at all levels. Let them see how we operate, how we treat each other, and let our people evaluate whether they'd be a good fit for our culture." It was an unconventional approach, but then again, everything about Nexus's transformation had been unconventional. Ruth approved the new hiring process, and within weeks, they were seeing results. The candidates who thrived in the new interview process were those who genuinely valued collaboration, respect, and dignity. Those who were uncomfortable with the egalitarian approach self-selected out, saving everyone time and potential cultural conflicts. Meanwhile, Gavin Reeds was struggling to find his place in a post-Nexus world. He sat in a coffee shop near his downtown apartment, scrolling through job listings on his laptop. 6 months of unemployment had been devastating to both his finances and his ego. The severance package from Nexus had been generous, but his attempts to find new executive positions had been consistently frustrated. The problem wasn't his qualifications. His track record of financial success was undeniable. The problem was his reputation. The story of his dismissal had become legendary in corporate circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of toxic leadership. When potential employers Googled his name, they found articles about the handshake incident, about the culture of fear he'd created, about the board's unanimous vote to remove him. Gavin had considered moving to another city, starting fresh somewhere his reputation hadn't preceded him. But the business world was smaller than most people realized, and social media made truly fresh starts nearly impossible. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, asking about his job search. They'd divorced 2 years earlier, partly due to the stress and demands of his position at Nexus, partly because she'd grown tired of the man he'd become. She wasn't cruel about his situation, but her concern felt more like pity than genuine care. "Still looking," he texted back. "Something will come up." But Gavin was beginning to wonder if that was true. He'd spent so many years believing that results were all that mattered, that his success gave him license to treat people however he chose. Now he was learning that reputation mattered too, and his was irreparably damaged. Back at Nexus, the success story continued to unfold. The company's stock price had not only recovered from the initial volatility following Gavin's departure, it had reached all-time highs. Investors had initially been nervous about the leadership transition, but the improved employee satisfaction scores, reduced turnover costs, and increased productivity had convinced even the most skeptical shareholders. Ruth was presenting the quarterly results to the board when she noticed something that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Luis was in the room, not as a janitor cleaning up after the meeting, but as a full participant. The board had voted unanimously to create a position for an employee representative, someone who could provide ground-level perspective on policy decisions. Luis had been the obvious choice. "Employee satisfaction is at an all-time high," Ruth reported. "Turnover is down 67%. Our Glassdoor rating has improved from 2.3 stars to 4.8 stars. And we're seeing concrete business benefits. Productivity is up, innovation metrics are improving, and our customer satisfaction scores have increased dramatically." Thomas Bradford, the financial advisor who'd initially been skeptical of the changes, was now one of their strongest advocates. "The numbers don't lie," he said. "Treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's financially smart. Our cost per hire has dropped significantly, our training expenses are down because people aren't leaving, and our reputation as an employer is actually helping us win new business." Michael Chung nodded enthusiastically. "We're getting calls from companies who want to work with us specifically because of our culture. They see us as a partner they can trust, someone who shares their values." But Luis raised a concern that nobody else might have thought to mention. "We need to be careful about complacency," he said. "Success can make people forget how they got there. We can't assume that because things are good now, they'll stay good automatically. Culture requires constant attention, constant reinforcement." Ruth smiled at his insight. It was exactly the kind of perspective they needed, someone who remembered what the company had been like at its worst, who understood how fragile positive change could be. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "Regular check-ins. Not just with management, but with everyone. Anonymous feedback systems. Maybe even bringing in outside consultants periodically to assess our culture from an objective perspective." The suggestion was adopted immediately. Within weeks, Nexus had instituted quarterly culture audits, comprehensive assessments of workplace dynamics, employee satisfaction, and leadership effectiveness. The results would be shared transparently with all employees, creating accountability at every level. The transformation of Nexus Technologies had become more than just a business success story. It had become a movement. Other companies were studying their model, trying to replicate their results. Business schools were writing case studies. Ruth and Luis were invited to speak at conferences and corporate retreats. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Ruth was in her office when Jennifer Mills knocked on her door, her expression excited. "Ma'am, there's someone here to see you. She says she's from the National Association of Janitors and Building Services Workers." Ruth was intrigued. The organization represented cleaning and maintenance workers across the country, advocating for fair wages, safe working conditions, and dignity in the workplace. The woman who entered was in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of fighting for workers' rights. She introduced herself as Carmen Rodriguez, the association's president. Ms. Chin Williams, I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done here. Luis Morales' story has inspired workers across the country. You've shown that change is possible, that companies can choose to value all their employees. Ruth was moved by the recognition, but she deflected credit where it belonged. Luis deserves the recognition, not me. His dignity in the face of disrespect is what started all of this, which is why we'd like to present him with our annual Dignity at Work Award. It's given to someone who exemplifies the values we're fighting for: respect, fairness, and the recognition that all work has value. The award ceremony was held in the Nexus cafeteria, with Patricia Williams providing catering that rivaled any upscale restaurant. Employees from every department attended, along with representatives from other companies who'd come to learn about the transformation. Luis stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had once been invisible to each other but were now a true community. The janitor who'd been refused a handshake 6 months earlier was now being honored for his contribution to workplace dignity. "This award doesn't belong just to me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "It belongs to everyone who believes that work should be about more than just a paycheck. It belongs to everyone who treats their colleagues with respect, regardless of their job title. It belongs to everyone who understands that we're all in this together." The applause was thunderous, but what moved Luis most were the faces in the crowd. Maria Santos, tears streaming down her cheeks. James Rodriguez, the security guard whose education was being supported by the company. Patricia Williams, beaming with pride from behind the catering table. Ruth Chin Williams, the CEO who'd recognized his worth when others saw only a janitor. But also in the crowd were faces he didn't recognize. New employees who'd been attracted by the company's reputation, visitors from other organizations who wanted to understand how such dramatic change was possible. The transformation of Nexus Technologies had become proof that corporate culture could be changed, that companies could choose humanity over efficiency, that success and dignity weren't mutually exclusive. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.